Think you're having a rough day? Your Wi-Fi is slow, your coffee got cold, and you're stuck in traffic? Well, buckle up because I'm about to take you on a journey that'll make you kiss the ground of the 21st century. Medieval life wasn't just hard. It was a psychological and physical nightmare that would shatter your modern mind faster than you can say, "Where's the nearest Starbucks?" Today, we're diving deep into the brutal reality of medieval existence. And I'm not talking about the Hollywood version with noble knights and fair maidens. I'm talking about the real deal, the stuff that history books politely gloss over. By the end of this video, you'll understand why time travel to the Middle Ages would be the worst vacation of your life. Let's start with something basic, food. You know that feeling when you're hangry and there's nothing good in the fridge? Well, medieval people lived that nightmare every single day, except their nothing good could literally poison them. Forget your Instagram-worthy meals. Medieval cuisine was a game of Russian roulette with your digestive system. The average peasant's diet consisted mainly of something called pottage, essentially a watery gruel made from whatever vegetables hadn't rotted yet. Imagine eating the same flavorless soup for weeks, cooked in a pot that was never properly cleaned, with mysterious chunks floating in it that you really hoped were just vegetables. But here's where it gets terrifying: the bread. Today, we complain if our bread isn't artisanal enough. Medieval bread was actively trying to kill you. It was made with flour ground by stone wheels that shed particles into the mix, essentially giving you a mouthful of tiny rocks with every bite. Your teeth weren't just tools for eating. They were constantly being filed down by your daily bread. And then there was ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, and it produces compounds similar to LSD. Entire villages would unknowingly consume ergot-contaminated bread and experience mass hallucinations, convulsions, and burning sensations in their limbs. Some historians believe ergot poisoning contributed to the Salem witch trials and other periods of mass hysteria. Imagine thinking your neighbor is possessed by demons when really, your local baker just had poor quality control. Here's a fun fact that'll blow your mind. The average medieval person consumed about 8 pints of ale daily, including children as young as 5 years old. This wasn't because they were all alcoholics. It was because water was so contaminated it could kill you faster than the ale could. The brewing process actually made ale safer than water because it killed harmful bacteria. So yes, medieval toddlers were technically day drinking out of survival necessity. Meat was a luxury that came with its own risks. Without refrigeration, meat was often on the verge of spoiling. People used heavy spices not for flavor, but to mask the taste of decomposition. If you couldn't afford spices, you just held your breath and hoped for the best. The medieval sniff test had much lower standards than ours. Now let's talk about something we take completely for granted: going to the bathroom. In medieval times, this basic human need was a public health disaster wrapped in a social nightmare. Most people used chamber pots, basically fancy buckets kept under their beds. Once full, the contents were either emptied by the user or collected by someone else. Where did it go? Often straight out the window into the street below. Cities had people whose job it was to shout, "Gardez-le," from the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, before dumping waste from upper-story windows. Of course, by water, they meant something far less pleasant. The wealthy had slightly better options. Castles featured garderobes, essentially holes in stone seats that dropped waste straight down the castle wall. Some castles had garderobes that dropped waste 70 feet or more. Imagine being a visitor approaching a castle and having to dodge falling human waste. Medieval GPS would have included biohazard zones around every major building. But here's the psychological horror. There was no privacy. Even in wealthy households, bathrooms were communal spaces. Multiple people would use the same garderobe simultaneously, making it a social gathering spot. Medieval bathroom etiquette was probably the most awkward small talk in history. For those who couldn't make it home, public areas had designated spots that were essentially open sewers. London's Thames River was so polluted with human waste that it was described as a monster of stink. The smell was so bad that Parliament had to be moved when the river's odor became unbearable during hot summers. And toilet paper? Forget about it. People used whatever was available: leaves, moss, their left hand, which is why the left hand was considered unclean in many cultures. Or if they were wealthy, pieces of wool or hemp. The Romans had used sponges on sticks that they'd rinse in communal buckets of salt water or vinegar, but that knowledge was largely lost by medieval times. Think your job is stressful? Medieval work was a daily battle against death, dismemberment, and occupational diseases that would make modern safety inspectors faint. About 90% of the population were peasant farmers who worked from dawn to dusk using primitive tools. A typical day involved plowing fields with wooden implements pulled by oxen, planting seeds by hand, and harvesting crops with basic sickles. During harvest season, people worked 16-hour days in scorching heat. Records show that medieval farm workers burned over 4,000 calories daily just from physical labor. That's like running 2 marathons every day. But farming was just one option in a menu of occupational nightmares. Blacksmiths spent their days in smoke-filled forges, breathing toxic fumes and risking severe burns. Many developed lung diseases from constant smoke inhalation. Tanners, who processed animal hides into leather, worked with urine and toxic chemicals that turned their skin yellow and gave them a permanent odor that made them social outcasts. Want to learn a trade? Better start young, like really young. Apprenticeships typically began at age 7, when children were sent to live with master craftsmen. These kids worked 6 to 7 days a week for up to 14 years before they could become journeymen. Child labor laws didn't exist because childhood itself was barely recognized as a distinct life stage. Some jobs were specifically designed for the desperate. Pure finders collected dog feces to sell to tanners. Dog waste was used in leather processing. Night soil men collected human waste from cesspits. Gong farmers cleaned out public latrines and could only work at night because the smell was so offensive they weren't allowed in public during the day. The pay for most jobs would barely cover survival. A day laborer might earn 1 to 2 pennies per day, just enough to buy a couple loaves of bread. There was no concept of minimum wage because the concept was, minimum you need to not die before finishing your work. Feeling sick? In medieval times, going to a doctor was often more dangerous than the illness itself. Medieval medicine was a horrifying combination of superstition, guesswork, and what we'd now consider torture. The prevailing medical theory was based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed illness came from an imbalance of these fluids. Got a fever? You obviously have too much blood. The solution: bloodletting, cutting open a vein and draining blood into a bowl. This weakened patients when they needed strength most. Leeches were another popular treatment. These blood-sucking parasites were applied to the skin to draw out bad blood. One medical text recommended using up to 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. Imagine being covered in dozens of slimy, blood-sucking worms as a form of healthcare. The mortality statistics are staggering. About 30% of children died before age 5. Average life expectancy was 30 to 40 years. The Black Death killed roughly 50% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Simple infections that we treat with over-the-counter medicines today were death sentences. Dental care was particularly nightmarish. Without proper toothbrushes or understanding of dental hygiene, tooth decay was universal. Medieval dentists were essentially torturers who pulled teeth with crude tools and no anesthesia. Many people died from dental infections that spread to their bloodstream. Even the medicines that existed were often deadlier than the diseases. Mercury was prescribed for everything from skin conditions to syphilis. Lead was used in cosmetics and medicines. These cures often caused heavy metal poisoning, which was worse than the original ailment. Mental health wasn't understood at all. People with mental illness were thought to be possessed by demons or cursed. Treatment involved exorcism, physical restraints, or abandonment. The concept of therapy or psychiatric medication was centuries away. Think our legal system has problems? Medieval justice was a nightmare of arbitrary punishment, trial by torture, and public execution as entertainment. Laws varied wildly between regions. What was legal in one village could get you executed 5 miles away. There were no standardized legal codes, and most people had no idea what was actually illegal until they were accused of breaking it. The punishment rarely fit the crime. Stealing food when you were starving could result in having your hand chopped off. In medieval England, over 200 different crimes carried the death penalty, including cutting down a tree in the king's forest or stealing property worth more than 12 pence. Trials were nothing like modern court proceedings. If you were accused of a crime, proving your innocence often involved trial by ordeal. One method required carrying a red-hot iron bar for 9 feet. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were innocent. If they became infected, which was almost guaranteed, you were guilty. Another popular method was trial by water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river or lake. If you sank, you were innocent and probably drowned. If you floated, you were guilty and executed. The logic was that water, being pure, would reject the guilty. It was literally a no-win situation. Public executions were community events. Drawing and quartering, where the condemned was dragged by horses, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and cut into 4 pieces, was reserved for the worst crimes. These events drew huge crowds who brought food and drinks like they were attending a festival. Medieval prisons weren't for long-term punishment. They were holding cells until your actual punishment could be carried out. These dungeons were dark, overcrowded pits where prisoners were chained to walls. No food was provided. Prisoners relied on family members to bring meals or they starved. Medieval warfare wasn't about honor and glory. It was about survival in a world where conflict was constant and brutally lethal. Wars seemed endless. The 100 Years' War between England and France lasted 116 years, 1337 to 1453. The average medieval person would experience multiple wars during their lifetime. Unlike today, where many people live entire lives without seeing combat, medieval civilians were regularly caught in conflict zones. Most soldiers weren't knights in shining armor. Full-plate armor cost the equivalent of a modern luxury car, about 2 to 3 years' income for a skilled craftsman. Most soldiers wore padded cloth garments with perhaps a few metal plates if they were lucky. The majority fought with agricultural tools modified as weapons. Medieval battles were incredibly lethal. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, roughly 28,000 men died in a single day, about 1% of England's entire male population. Many froze to death in the snowstorm that accompanied the battle before they ever saw combat. For civilians, the worst part of war wasn't the battles. It was what armies did between fights. Medieval armies lived off the land, meaning they took whatever food and supplies they needed from local villages. This involved burning crops, killing livestock, and destroying homes. Soldiers from both sides would ransack communities, leaving civilians to starve. Sieges were particularly horrific. When armies surrounded cities, those trapped inside faced slow starvation. During the Siege of Paris in 885 to 886, inhabitants resorted to eating rats, cats, and eventually each other. Some sieges lasted years. The Siege of Candia, modern Heraklion, lasted 21 years, the longest in history. Even if you avoided war, disease, and legal trouble, daily medieval life was a psychological endurance test that would break modern minds. The smell would hit you first. Medieval towns reeked of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, tanning chemicals, and smoke from countless fires. Without garbage collection, trash piled up in streets. Butchers dumped animal entrails outside their shops. The smell was so overwhelming that wealthy people carried small pouches of herbs called pomanders to hold under their noses. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. Most people bathed only a few times a year, usually in spring and late summer. Many believed bathing opened pores and allowed disease to enter the body. During winter, people might go 4 to 5 months without washing. Head lice were so common that special combs for removing them were standard grooming tools. Privacy didn't exist. Most households consisted of one room where everyone ate, worked, and slept together. Beds were shared by multiple family members, and travelers would share beds with strangers at inns. Even wealthy homes had servants present at all times. The language barrier would be nearly insurmountable. Middle English from the 1400s sounds almost like a foreign language to modern speakers. Common phrases would be incomprehensible. You'd struggle to understand others, and they'd think you were speaking gibberish. Entertainment options were limited and often violent. Public executions drew large crowds and were treated as festivals. Animal baiting, where dogs attacked chained bears or bulls, was popular. Less violent options included watching traveling performers, but these were rare treats. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. About 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing and worked land belonging to nobles. Social mobility was nearly impossible. You were born into your station and would die there. After this journey through medieval horrors, your modern problems probably seem pretty manageable. That delayed train? At least you're not walking 20 miles in leather shoes with holes. That cold you're fighting? At least you're not getting treated with leeches and bloodletting. That difficult boss? At least they can't legally chop off your hand for minor mistakes. Medieval life was a daily struggle against death, disease, and despair that few modern humans could endure even for a day. The past may look romantic in movies and books, but the reality was a nightmare of suffering that makes our worst days look like luxury vacations. The next time you flip a light switch, turn on a tap, or grab food from your refrigerator, remember that you're living better than the wealthiest medieval king. You have access to clean water, effective medicine, human rights, and the ability to communicate instantly with people around the world. You're living in the most prosperous, healthy, and comfortable time in human history. So the next time someone says, "I was born in the wrong era," you can confidently tell them, "No, you absolutely were not. Trust me on this one, medieval life would break your mind in less than 24 hours. What did you think of this journey through medieval horrors? Which aspect of medieval life shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most brutal realities.